Once upon a time there was a class that wrote Japan's fate with their swords. So how did this class, which no army could defeat, disappear from history? Drawn from history. Among the mountains of Japan, there were villages that for centuries no one had seen or heard of. The mist would wrap around the foothills of the mountains like a shroud. The heart of Japan beat among the whispers of bamboo forests. The children born in these villages grew up far from war and politics. They were farmers. They were fishermen. Sometimes they ran through rice fields. Sometimes they skipped stones by a stream. Sometimes they fished in the rivers. But the fate of some children was written on the day they were born. In those days, Japan was not a single empire. The country was divided into warring domains. Each lord tried to protect his own lands and gathered power against the others. Villages were looted, caravans were plundered, and it was the innocent people caught in between who suffered the most. In this chaos, ordinary soldiers were no longer enough because war had exhausted everyone, and people no longer wanted to fight. War demanded discipline, loyalty, and people who were willing to die without fear. At this point, something new was needed, a new force that would be raised to fight for life, loyal only to its master, that would know neither fear nor retreat. And so Japan made a decision that would shape its future. A unit called the samurai would be created. Those who would form the beginning of this order were chosen as children, not the strongest, but the most obedient, children who could suppress their fear, who would not blink when given orders, who could endure pain in silence. They were taken from their families. One morning they left their homes, and by evening they did not return. The cries of their mothers echoed across the mountain slopes. These chosen children no longer had names. They had numbers and they had units. While their peers played games, these children trained until they collapsed from exhaustion. They learned respect. They learned silence. They learned to become numb to pain. Most importantly, they learned not to question, because becoming a samurai began with the mind. They were not taught to make decisions. They were taught to wait for orders. Over time, these children became not just warriors, but parts of a system. And Japan, without realizing it, created a class that would change its destiny. As this class grew, the balance of the country began to change. Wars were no longer fought by randomly gathered peasants, but by cold-blooded, trained, unhesitating samurai. And these men slowly became the true power of Japan. For someone who wanted to become a samurai, the hardest thing was not learning to hold a sword. The hardest thing was getting used to the order and to pain, because the purpose of samurai training was not to strengthen the body first, but to create a mind that did not react to pain. Children were placed in cold water at a very young age. They were laid in the snow in winter. They were kept awake at night. They were left in dark pits so they would feel hunger and fear. None of this was seen as torture or cruelty, because the goal was this: to defeat fear. Even if a samurai felt fear, his decisions were not supposed to be affected by it. They were taught this: if you fear death, you cannot protect your master. That is why death became an accepted end for a samurai. Their days followed a single routine: wake up, serve, sleep. This order prevented them from being individuals and bound them to a system. Contrary to what is believed, sword training was not the first lesson for samurai. First, they were taught demeanor, how to stand, how to look, how to kneel, because for a samurai, how and where he behaved and how he carried his body also mattered. Then came sword and combat training. But the sword was introduced not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. They were taught this: this sword does not move by your will. It moves by your master's will. So a samurai did not carry out his own decisions with his sword. The sword was the words and authority of his master. As the training progressed, one single thought was carved into the minds of samurai candidates: loyalty is more valuable than life. For a samurai, family came second. Even his own name came second. What mattered most was who he belonged to. That is why samurai continued to live to take revenge for their masters, even after their masters were killed. Sometimes when their master died, they found life meaningless and took their own lives, because for them, life itself was not valuable. Life only had meaning as long as they served, and a child who went through this training could no longer think like an ordinary human years later. That is why when samurai stepped onto the battlefield, they were different from other soldiers. They did not fear, because they had defeated fear in childhood. But while this made them powerful, it also distanced them from their humanity. Samurai who came out of training were no longer just warriors. They were the force that would change Japan's destiny. In feudal Japan, the country was divided into small domains. These lords were called Daimyō. Each Daimyō maintained a samurai army to protect his lands. Samurai were not used only on the battlefield. They also suppressed rebellions, protected tax collectors, served as personal guards for lords, conducted espionage, intimidated rival families. In other words, a samurai was not just a soldier who swung a sword, but had become a tool of power. When civil wars began in Japan, samurai showed their true face for the first time. Villages were burned, castles were besieged, brother raised a sword against brother. In these wars, the fame of the samurai spread, because they did not retreat, they only carried out orders. They did not step back. Even when a samurai realized he would lose, he continued to fight, because what mattered was not survival, but obeying orders and dying with honor. In this period, some samurai became legends. Their names were whispered among the people. They were no longer just soldiers, but symbols of fear. But as power grew, control became more difficult. Some samurai realized their own power and rebelled against their masters, so the system began to be struck by its own weapon. Samurai who once only served were now turning into a class that sought power, and a new era was beginning in Japan. Samurai were preparing not only to fight, but to rule. This was their rise toward the peak. But every peak has a fall, and just before that fall began, the lands of Japan witnessed an event unseen for many years. A group of samurai who trusted their own strength gathered. First, secret oaths were sworn. Swords were driven into the ground by the night fires. A handful of samurai formed their own unit, but this small spark grew quickly. One more samurai joined, then another, and then hundreds who were afraid even to whisper their lord's names. This was no longer a group, it was an army. The rebelling samurai rose against the daimyo of a region. They besieged castles, stopped tax caravans, and raised their own banners on the roads. This was not just a rebellion. This was the first great challenge by samurai who sought to change the order. At first, the other daimyo did not take this threat seriously, because those opposing them were also samurai. But when the scale of the rebellion became clear, they realized the danger. The lords of the lands were forced to set aside their rivalries. Daimyo, who would normally never sit at the same table, came together for the first time out of the same fear. Orders were given. Each gathered their most loyal samurai. Armor was donned. Banners were raised. Drums began to beat. Two samurai armies stood face to face on the same battlefield. On one side, rebels blinded by dreams of freedom and power. On the other, loyal warriors sent to protect the order. The wind made the banners of both armies wave at the same time. The ground trembled under thousands of steps. And then, the first arrow was raised. The sky darkened in an instant. When the rain of arrows fell to the ground, the battle had begun. Swords clashed against swords. Armor shattered. Horses fell. War cries echoed through the valleys. This was a civil war. Samurai were drawing their swords against samurai. Hours passed. The sun rose, then slowly began to set. The rebel samurai were brave, but the force against them was greater. The armies of the daimyo were larger in number, and the samurai under their command were ready to die. In the end, the ranks of the rebel army began to break. First one unit scattered, then another. The wounded were dragged back. The banners fell to the ground. The rebellion was crushed. The surviving samurai fled. Some were captured, some were executed. Some were driven into lives where they would never even be able to speak their own names again. This battle showed everyone how powerful samurai could be, but at the same time it proved how dangerous they could become when left unchecked. From that day on, fear was added for the first time to the admiration people felt for samurai. Yet still, in the stories told among the people, samurai were always portrayed the same way. They never lied. They never raised a sword against the innocent. They always lived with honor. They faced death without fear. These stories were passed down this way for centuries, and the image of the honorable samurai we know today was born like this. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was the moral code of the samurai. Loyalty, courage, honesty, fearlessness in the face of death. On paper it was perfect, but in war, rules were often the first things to disappear. Samurai did not question orders, even if the order was to burn an innocent village. Because the harshest rule of Bushido was this: loyalty to one's master is above all else. That is why some samurai were forced to fight against their own conscience, and some silenced their conscience completely. In this period, samurai were not a hope for the people, but sometimes a nightmare. When peasants heard the sound of samurai horses, they hid in their homes, because in those days no one was held accountable for the life a samurai took. This was the dark side behind the legend. But despite all this darkness, samurai were the most respected class in society, because the order was built upon them, and this system stood for centuries, until the world changed. In the 16th century, the first firearms that arrived in Japan became a turning point for the samurai. Centuries of sword and combat training began to lose meaning with a single burst of gunpowder. A weapon that even a peasant could use could kill a samurai who had trained for a lifetime with a single shot. This meant not only a change in war, but a change in the entire order. The greatest strength of the samurai was their mastery and discipline, but against guns, this advantage vanished in an instant. As time passed, Japan opened to the outside world. Western technology entered the country. New armies were formed. Warriors were no longer chosen by birth, but selected and trained by the state. And one day, an official decision was made. The samurai class was abolished. Carrying swords was banned. The system that paid samurai salaries was dismantled. The warriors who were once feared became unemployed overnight. Some became farmers, some became merchants, some forgot their past and blended into modern life, but some could not forget their past. Those who could not lay down their swords, those who wanted the old order to return, rose up one last time. But with the gunpowder weapons of the new order, all these uprisings were easily crushed. The samurai disappeared, but the spirit of the samurai was etched deep into Japanese society. Today there are no samurai on the streets of Japan, but the legacy they left behind still lives on, because they were not just warriors. They were the guardians of an era, and the ones who brought about its end. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe and leave a like. You can also write in the comments which historical topics you'd like to see next. See you in the next video.